My name's Wade Conlin. I was a deputy with the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department in north central Idaho for 11 years. And I'm telling you this now because I left the job in 2020, and the only people who could still discipline me for talking about it are either retired or gone in other ways. And I've decided I don't care anymore if anybody believes me. I just need to get it out of my head and into the air where somebody else has to carry it for a while. The town was Pierce, maybe 200 people if you counted the ones who came back for hunting season. It sits about an hour east of Orofino off Highway 11, and past Pierce, the road narrows and starts climbing into the Clearwater National Forest, which is most of what we worked. 2 million acres of timber and rock and old logging roads that nobody had maintained since the 80s. We had 4 deputies for a county the size of Connecticut. You learn to leave people alone out there. Most of the folks who live up in the woods came to the woods specifically because they didn't want anybody checking on them, and a wellness check in Clearwater County usually meant you drove out, knocked on a door, got told to mind your own business, and drove back. That was the job. But sometimes the job was the other kind. Saul Mertens lived about 16 miles up Skull Creek Road in a cabin he had built himself in the 1980s. I'd met him twice in my years on the force. Once when his nearest neighbor reported gunshots, which turned out to be Saul shooting at a black bear that kept getting into his trash, and once when I gave him a ride back from Orofino after his truck broke down. He was a man who didn't waste words, late 60s, lean, hair gone white but still thick, and he had a way of looking at you when you talked that made you feel like you were being measured against something specific. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam, and he'd been a wilderness surveyor for the Forest Service for almost 30 years after that. He knew the woods up there better than anybody alive. I want to say something about Saul before I describe what was on his table that morning, because I think it matters to understand who he was. He was not a man who scared easy. The first time I met him, the gunshot call, he had walked out of his cabin in his shirt sleeves at 30 degrees with his .30-06 over his shoulder and offered me coffee. He had a way of standing very still when he listened to you, like he was registering every word for later. When I gave him the ride from Orofino that other time, we drove for almost an hour and he said maybe 6 things, and every one of them was useful. He told me what was wrong with my truck. He pointed out which bridge on the way back was about to fail. He mentioned his sister's name and that she'd remarried twice and was happier the second time. He was not a man who wasted my time. He was not a man I could imagine writing 2,000 iterations of the same sentence in a journal. If you had told me in 1995 or 2000 that Saul Mertens would end his life by walking into a meadow at midnight to talk with something that had been knocking on his door, I would have laughed at you. I would have told you that whatever Saul Mertens decided to do at midnight, he would do with intention, and he would come back and he would not lose his mind doing it. I want you to remember that as I tell the rest of this. His sister called us on October 12th, 2016. She lived in Spokane, and she said she hadn't heard from him in 3 months, which by itself wouldn't have alarmed her. But he'd missed her birthday in September, and Saul never missed her birthday. She told me that in the 41 years since their mother had died, he had called her on her birthday every single year. So, she was calling us. I drove up there the next morning. It was a clear, cold day in the mountains. The aspens had already turned, and the road was carpeted with yellow leaves the size of my palm. I took it slow because Skull Creek Road is a washboard of frost heaves and exposed rebar where the gravel's been ground away, and I didn't want to lose a tire 15 miles from the nearest tow truck. The temperature gauge in the cruiser said 41. The forest on both sides was that deep wet green that pine forest gets after a hard rain, and the air coming in through my cracked window smelled like cedar and wet stone, and underneath that, the faint sour tang of mushrooms breaking down on the forest floor. Normal. Everything was normal. Saul's cabin sat in a clearing about 100 yards off the road, accessible by a narrow track that branched off through a stand of larch. I parked at the turnoff and walked the last stretch on foot because I always did, and because the track was too narrow for the cruiser anyway. I had my radio on my shoulder and my service weapon on my hip, and I was already thinking about the paperwork I'd have to fill out depending on what I found. Most missing persons calls in our county ended with the person not actually being missing. They were just out hunting, or they'd gone to visit somebody without telling anyone, or they were sleeping off a 3-day drunk. I was hoping for one of those. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Single story, hand-hewn logs, green metal roof, a stone chimney on the north side, a small porch with 2 chairs and an empty coffee can he used as an ashtray. His truck was parked beside the cabin, an old Ford F-250 in faded blue with mud splatter up to the door handles. I touched the hood, cold. I called his name from the bottom of the porch steps. Nothing. I went up and knocked on the door. 3 knocks, identified myself. Waited. Nothing. The door wasn't locked. People up there don't lock their doors, partly because they trust their neighbors and partly because if a bear gets in your cabin, you'd rather it leave through the door than the window. I went in. The smell hit me first. Not death, I want to be clear about that. I've been to dead body calls. I know what a body smells like after 3 months. This was different. It was the smell of a place that had been closed up and damp for a while. Mildew and old food in the sink. But underneath it there was something else. Something faintly metallic and faintly sweet. Like blood in copper pipes, but not quite either of those things. I had my hand on my sidearm before I made the conscious decision to put it there. The cabin was one room with a sleeping loft above. Kitchen on the right with a propane stove and a cast iron sink with a hand pump. Wood stove in the corner, Saul's reading chair facing the front window. A wooden table in the center with 2 chairs. A bookshelf along the back wall that held maybe 200 books, and I remember being struck by how many of them were Bibles or had biblical-sounding titles, which surprised me because Saul had never struck me as a religious man. He wasn't there. The bed in the loft was made. His wallet and keys were on the kitchen counter. The propane bottle for the stove was 3/4 full. There was a half-eaten can of corned beef hash on the table that had grown a thin gray fur of mold, and a coffee mug next to it that still had liquid in the bottom of it, dried into a black crust. Whatever had happened, he'd left in the middle of a meal. And on the table next to the can of hash, there was the journal. It was leather, brown, maybe 7 inches by 10, hand-stitched at the spine. It had a leather thong that wrapped around it twice and tied off in a knot. And the knot was loose, like he'd been about to put it down, and then thought better of finishing the wrap. I pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves from my belt and picked it up. I want to tell you that I knew right then. That something cold came up through my spine when my fingers touched the leather and I understood I was holding something I shouldn't be touching. The truth is, I didn't feel anything special. I sat down at his table and opened the journal because that's what you do when you find a journal in a house where the owner is missing. You read it, you're looking for information, a name, a doctor's appointment, a destination, anything. The first entries went back to April. He'd been keeping the journal for about 6 months before he disappeared, and the early pages were ordinary. Weather notes, the price of diesel, a blade he'd sharpened, a neighbor named Dell who'd come by with a cooler of trout, an entry on May 4th that just said, "Saw the bear again, same one, ear notch healed, looking thin." This was a man recording his life. There was nothing in the first 30 pages I'd have flagged as unusual. The change came on June 21st. He wrote that he'd been out checking a trapline he kept up on a creek that ran north out of his property, and he'd come across tracks. He drew them in the journal. They were good drawings, the work a man does when he's been a surveyor for 30 years and knows how to measure a thing with his eye. Each track was about 14 inches long. They were canine in the toes, 4 pads with claw points, but the heel was wrong. The heel was elongated, almost human, like something had been walking partway up on its toes and partway flat-footed. The stride between prints was 62 inches, 6 feet 2 inches between footfalls. He'd noted it carefully, the way you'd note the length of a fence line. He wrote, "No bear does that. No wolf does that. No man I ever heard of does that." The next several entries returned to ordinary business, but you could feel something had shifted. He'd added a paragraph at the end of June 23rd, almost as an afterthought, that said he'd been hearing what he thought was an elk and rut behind the cabin around 2 in the morning for 3 nights running, but the sound was wrong for an elk. An elk didn't rut in June anyway. He wrote, "I know what an elk sounds like. This is not an elk." July 12th. He'd come home from town to find his porch chair turned around, just one of them, turned to face the front door instead of facing out at the woods. He wrote that he didn't think Dell had been by. Dell would have left a note. He couldn't think of anyone else who'd have come up that road, and there were no fresh tire tracks at the turnoff. July 29th. He found the first marks on the cedar pole at the corner of his woodshed, 4 parallel grooves about half an inch apart, dug deep into the wood, starting at about 7 feet off the ground and dragging downward. He'd run his fingers in the grooves, the way a man does when he's trying to make a thing physical to convince his own brain it's real. He'd noted that the wood inside the grooves was pale, fresh. Whatever made them had done so in the last 24 hours. After that, the journal changed character. The entries became longer. They became, I want to say, more lucid in a way that frightened me. A man writing in a journal for himself doesn't usually structure his sentences the way Saul started structuring his. He was writing for someone, writing for the record, writing in case somebody found it. He wrote about doing research. He had driven down to Lewiston and spent 3 days at the public library, and what he'd come back with was a stack of books I could see still on his shelf from where I sat. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, a used hardback called Watchers and Fallen Angels, an apocryphal tradition that had a Princeton library stamp on the spine. He'd taken notes, pages of notes. He wrote about a passage in Enoch where the Watchers, the angels who came down to earth and took human wives, had 200 chiefs, and they swore an oath together on Mount Hermon, and the children they produced were the Nephilim, giants, and when the giants died in the flood, their spirits were left to walk the earth, unclean spirits. He wrote, but not all of them died. The text says clearly, some of them survived. The text says they were hidden away in the valleys of the earth until the day of judgment. He'd underlined valleys of the earth. He wrote, I keep thinking about that. Valleys of the earth, not buried, hidden. The way a thing is hidden when somebody plans to come back for it. And I keep thinking about how big this country is, how much of it nobody walks. I've spent 30 years in these mountains. I haven't seen 1/10 of 1% of it. There are places up the Lochsa drainage where I would put money no human has set foot since the Nez Perce stopped going there. He wrote, I think there's something up there. I think there's been something up there for a long time, and I think it's noticed me. I stopped reading and stood up. I walked around the cabin. I looked at the windows. The glass in all of them was intact. The door I'd come in through was the only door. The loft had a small window facing west, and I climbed up to check it, and that was intact too. No broken pane, no forced entry. Saul Mertens had walked out of his cabin in the middle of a meal and not come back, and his truck was still here, and his wallet was still here, and his journal was still here. I sat back down and kept reading. He wrote about the smell first. The same smell I'd noticed when I came in, except sharper. He described it as iron and cold sap, like fresh-cut pine that had been left out in winter air, but with something underneath it, something he called an organic dampness he couldn't place. He'd smelled it 3 nights in a row in early August, always between 3 and 4 in the morning, always when he stepped out to use the outhouse. The smell would be there for about 10 minutes, and then it would be gone. He started leaving an audio recorder running at night. Cheap thing, what a court reporter would use, propped on the windowsill. He listened back to the recordings every morning. For 5 nights he got nothing but his own snoring and the wind. On the 6th night, August 14th, he got something. He wrote, recording starts normal. About 47 minutes in, I can hear myself turn over in the loft. 63 minutes in, there is a sound. I can describe it as breathing, but only because I do not have a better word. It is too slow to be human breathing. The interval between inhale and exhale is around 11 seconds. The volume is steady, which means the source is not moving. Whatever is making the sound is standing still outside the south wall of the cabin and breathing for exactly 19 minutes by my count. And then it stops. There is no sound of footsteps leaving. The sound just ends. As if whatever it was simply stopped breathing or stopped existing in the place where it had been breathing. He'd put the recorder in his glove compartment and driven to Lewiston the next day and made copies. He'd mailed one to his sister with a note that said, do not listen to this. Do not open this. Hold this for me. I will explain later. He'd kept 2 for himself. The next entry was August 15th, and it was 3 lines long. I saw one. It was standing in the larch about 20 yards from the cabin. It saw me see it. I am writing this with my back against the door, because I do not want to turn around right now. He didn't describe what he saw. He didn't say how tall it was or what it looked like. He came back to it on August 17th, 2 days later, in a longer entry. And what he wrote then, I'm going to give you exactly as I read it, because I have read it maybe 100 times in the last several years, and I want to get it right. He wrote, it was the height of a tall man and then some, maybe 7 feet. The legs were wrong, the knees bent the wrong direction, like a dog's hind legs, but stretched out to a length that could only work standing up. The head was long, longer than a man's. The face came forward into a snout that was not exactly a wolf's snout, and not exactly a man's face, but the worst kind of meeting place between the two. There was hair on the body and face, but not enough to call it fur. You could see skin underneath, gray skin. The arms hung at its sides, and they were long. The hands at the ends of them were articulate. I want you to understand that. The fingers were articulate. They moved the way human fingers move. There were 5 of them on each hand, and there were thumbs, and they flexed once while I watched, as if it was thinking with its hands. He wrote, the eyes were the worst part. I have to make myself describe this. The eyes were not animal eyes. They were not the flat shine you get from a deer or a wolf at night when the headlights hit them. They were dark, and they were intelligent, and they were old. I do not have a better word than old. They were old in a way that I felt in my own bones when they looked at me. The way you feel when you stand in a building older than this country, and you suddenly understand how brief you are. He wrote, and then it raised one of its hands and touched the side of its own face with 2 fingers. A gesture. like a man considering, like a man thinking through a problem, and then it turned and walked back into the larch and the woods closed around it. He wrote at the bottom of the page, almost as a footnote, "I think I have just seen one of the watchers." I closed the journal at this point. I had to. My hands were shaking and I needed to put something in them that wasn't the journal. I made coffee in his kitchen, used his propane stove, used his percolator. I sat back down with the mug in my hands and let it warm my fingers. The wind had picked up outside, and I could hear it moving through the larch. The same larch he was writing about. The same larch where he'd seen the thing. I want to be honest about something. At this point in reading, I had a clear thought, and the thought was this. Saul Mertens was a Vietnam veteran in his late 60s who lived alone in the woods and read his Bible. He had probably had a psychiatric episode, a late onset something, and he had walked off into the forest in the throes of it and died of exposure, or fallen into a ravine, or been taken by an actual bear, and the journal was the record of his decline. That was a complete and tidy explanation, and I latched onto it the way a drowning man latches onto driftwood. I drank my coffee and I told myself I had a paperwork problem and a search and rescue problem, and not the other thing. Then I opened the journal again and kept reading because that was my job. He'd seen them, plural, on August 23rd, 3 of them, standing in a loose triangle about 30 yards off, in the meadow at the back of his property. They had stood and watched the cabin for what he estimated was 40 minutes. He'd watched them through binoculars from the loft window. He noted that one was larger than the other two, and that the larger one had a deeper coloration along the back. He noted that none of them moved their feet during the 40 minutes. He noted that one of them, the largest, turned its head once and looked directly at the loft window, directly into the binoculars, directly at his eyes, and held the look for almost a minute. He wrote, "It knew exactly where I was." He started seeing them more often after that. Not every night, but enough. He kept careful notes. He correlated their appearances with the lunar cycle and found no correlation. He correlated them with weather and found no correlation. He correlated them with his own sleep and meal schedule and found no correlation. He correlated them with his radio reception and noted, with the detail only an old surveyor would think to record, that his AM radio went to dead static within about 10 minutes of an appearance, as if something about them disturbed the air in a way that scattered the carrier wave. He went back to his books. He spent another 4 days in Lewiston. He came home with photocopies he taped into the pages of the journal, and I sat there in his cabin and read what he'd photocopied, page by page. Verses from Enoch chapter 15. "The spirits of the giants shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. The spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they have proceeded from them." Verses from Enoch chapter 10. "The Lord said unto Michael, Bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation." He'd underlined valleys of the earth again. He'd written in the margin, in pencil, "Idaho is full of valleys." He'd photocopied a chapter from a book about the Nephilim that described them as not entirely angel and not entirely man, but a hybrid of the two. And he'd written in the margin, "Hybrid. The Apocrypha is clear, they are hybrid creatures." And he'd photocopied a passage I had to read 3 times before I understood what I was reading. It was from a commentary on the Book of Jubilees, and it described one of the post-flood demons, the spirits of the dead Nephilim, as having the head of a hound and the body of a man. The commentator had noted in a footnote that this iconography appeared independently in multiple cultures, including the Egyptian Anubis, the Mesopotamian dog-headed sky guardians, and various Native American oral traditions of the Pacific Northwest, in which a man with the head of a wolf walked the high places and acted as both guardian and warning. Saul had circled the words guardian and warning. He wrote in his journal, beside the photocopy, "I think the watchers had children. I think the children are still here. I think these things are not the watchers themselves. I think they are what the watchers left behind." He wrote, "If that is true, then they are very old and they are not going anywhere." He wrote, "I have to figure out what they want." I was about halfway through the journal at this point, and the entries were getting denser, longer, more obsessive. The handwriting was getting smaller, as if he wanted to fit more on each page. He was writing every day now, sometimes multiple entries per day. He'd started time-stamping them. 3:47 a.m., 5:12 a.m., 11:08 p.m. He was sleeping in shifts. He'd moved his bedding from the loft down to the floor, in front of the wood stove, because he wanted to be ready to move. He kept a rifle within arm's reach at all times. He was keeping a notebook of every sound outside the cabin, between dusk and dawn. By the time I got to the part of the journal I'm about to describe, I had been sitting in Saul Mertens's cabin for almost 4 hours. I had not radioed in. I had not checked in. The The radio sat on his table next to me, and I kept staring at it and not picking it up, because I did not know what I would say. I would have to say I'd found his cabin abandoned, which was the truth. I would have to say I'd found his journal, which was also the truth. And then I would have to say what was in the journal, and at that point I would either have to lie, or I would have to tell my sergeant that the man I was sent to find believed he was being watched by post-flood Nephilim spirits, and I would have to ask him what to do with that, and I already knew what he'd say. He'd say bring the journal in as evidence and we'll get a search and rescue going. I knew I should do that. I knew that's what the job demanded. But I also knew that the moment I brought that journal in, it would disappear into the same evidence locker where everything disappears, and somebody at the state would read it and laugh, and the case would be closed as a probable suicide by wilderness, and Saul Mertens would become a paragraph in the local paper, and a name on a missing persons database that nobody ever checked again. And whatever he was trying to communicate, whatever he had figured out, would die with him. So, I didn't radio in. Not yet. I kept reading. September 2nd. He'd gone out to the cedar pole where the original claw marks were, and he'd found new marks, higher this time, 8 feet up. He measured them. They were the same width, the same depth, the same 4 parallel lines. He wrote, same animal or same species, and they want me to know they have been back. September 4th. He'd found something else. About 60 yards behind the cabin, in a small clearing he sometimes used for splitting wood, he'd come across a circle. He drew it in the journal, a perfect circle about 10 feet in diameter, made of small stones, each stone roughly the size of a fist. The stones were placed about 6 inches apart. Inside the circle, the ground had been disturbed. The pine duff and needles had been swept aside, exposing the bare dirt. And in the bare dirt, drawn with what looked like a stick, were marks. He photographed them with his phone and taped the printed photographs into the journal. The marks were not any writing system I'd seen. They had the geometric quality of intentional symbols, the precision of something written, but they didn't match any alphabet I would have recognized. They were arranged in 3 rows, 12 marks in each row. He'd taken the photos to the university in Moscow, Idaho, hired a graduate student in linguistics to look at them, paid the kid $200 cash. The kid had said the marks didn't match Sumerian, didn't match Phoenician, didn't match early Hebrew, didn't match any known proto-writing system. But the kid had said they reminded him of something. He'd pulled down a book about a controversial inscription from a cave site in southern Turkey that some scholars believed predated all known writing systems by several thousand years. The marks weren't identical, but they shared what the kid called structural family resemblance. Same way of breaking sound into symbol, same way of clustering symbols into groups of 3. Saul had written, he said they look like very old writing, older than writing should be. He said it like a joke. I do not think it is a joke. September 7th. The night they spoke to him. He'd been at the kitchen table working on his notes when he heard very clearly somebody outside the cabin say his name. Just his name. Saul. Spoken in a voice he could not identify. He wrote, it was not a voice I had heard before. It was deep, but it was hollow, as if the speaker did not have the right kind of throat to make the sound. The way you can sometimes get a person who has had a tracheotomy to talk, where the words are recognizable, but they sound wrong because the resonance chamber is gone. Like that, but more so. He'd gone to the window, looked out, nothing, the wind in the trees. He'd gone back to his table, and his name was spoken again. Saul. Closer this time, coming from the porch. He'd reached for his rifle. He'd opened the door, rifle up, finger off the trigger, but ready. The porch was empty. The clearing in front of the cabin was empty. The road was empty. He stood there for almost 5 minutes listening, and he heard nothing except the wind, and then he closed the door, and he locked it, which he had never done before in 30 years of living in that cabin. He sat back down at the table and he wrote, it knows my name, it learned my name. I do not know how. I have not said my name out loud to anyone in this forest in years, but it knows it. September 11th. Another voice, different, speaking from the meadow behind the cabin, calling him. September 15th. Voices on the porch, more than one. He could not make out words. September 18th. A knock on the door, 3 knocks, slow, evenly spaced, the way a person knocks on a front door. He didn't open it. September 20th. The knocks again. Same pattern. September 23rd. He found something on his porch. He drew it in the journal, a small bundle of pine boughs, fresh, tied together with what looked like sinew. Inside the bundle, a single tooth. Long, curved. He measured it, 3.5 inches. He could not identify the species. He wrote, It is too large for a bear. It is too curved for a cougar. It is shaped like a canine tooth, but it is twice the size of a wolf's. I think they are giving me a gift. I think they are trying to tell me something. I do not know how to read what they are saying. September 28th, the last normal entry. He wrote, I have decided I am going to go to them. They have not harmed me. They have spent 8 weeks watching me and approaching me and giving me gifts and learning my name, and they have not harmed me. Whatever they are, they want something from me. They want to be understood. Or they want me to understand something. I am going to walk up to the meadow tonight with no weapon, and I am going to sit in the grass, and I am going to wait. He wrote, if I do not come back, somebody who reads this should know I went willingly. They did not take me, I went. He wrote, if I do come back, I will write down what I learned. And then for 40 pages, he wrote the same sentence. I want to describe how this looked, because reading it on paper does not convey what it was like to turn the pages and see it. The first time the sentence appeared was at the top of the next page, October 1st, 3 days after the entry about going to the meadow. He had written the sentence once in his normal hand. Then below it, he had written it again, then again. Page after page after page of the same sentence written over and over, the handwriting deteriorating from the firm, clear script of the early entries into something cramped and frantic, and finally, on the last few pages, almost illegible. Just shaky lines suggesting the letters that should be there. 40 pages, maybe 2,000 iterations of the same sentence. The sentence was, the watchers never went home. That was all. No explanation, no date, no context. Just that line, written over and over, by a man who had walked out into the meadow behind his cabin on September 28th, 2016, and apparently come back from it, and apparently sat down at his table, and apparently spent days, possibly weeks, writing the same line until he stopped writing entirely. The last page was blank, except for the very bottom, where in fresh ink and his normal handwriting he had written, I have to go back. They are waiting for me to come back. I told them I would. The watchers never went home. I closed the journal. I sat for a long time in his chair with my hand on the cover. I want to tell you what was going through my head, and the truth is nothing was. My mind had gone very flat and very quiet, the way it goes flat at a bad scene when you're a deputy, where the brain stops trying to make sense of things and just records them so it can sort them out later. I sat there for I don't know how long. Eventually I heard wind hitting the side of the cabin, and I came back to myself, and I noticed that the light outside had changed. It was almost evening. I'd been in the cabin since just after 9 in the morning, and now it was almost 5, and the sun was getting low, and I was about to be in those woods after dark. I bagged the journal as evidence. I put a chain of custody tag on it. I locked the cabin. I walked back to my cruiser. I drove down Skull Creek Road as fast as I dared, which wasn't fast, and I got to the highway right around when the sun went behind the mountains, and I drove the rest of the way back to Pierce in the dark. I did not tell anybody about the contents of the journal that night. I logged it in as evidence under a vague description. Personal notebook, brown leather, decedent's residence. I went home. I poured myself a drink. I sat in my kitchen and stared at the wall and tried to decide what kind of report I was going to write. The next morning, I requested the search and rescue. I told them where the cabin was. I told them Saul Mertens was missing, probably on foot, possibly armed, no vehicle taken. I told them to start with the meadow behind the cabin and work outward in a spiral pattern. They asked me why the meadow. I said I had a hunch. The search team spent 4 days up there. They covered approximately 12 square miles. They did not find him. They did not find any sign of him. They did not find the stone circle, which by then I realized I should have photographed myself. By the time the search team got to the clearing where Saul had described it, the stones had been scattered. The dirt had been recovered with pine duff. The marks were gone, as if someone had cleaned up after him. The case stayed open. Missing persons. Presumed deceased by exposure. I was assigned other cases. Life went on. October became November. The first snow came, but I could not let it go. 3 weeks after the search and rescue closed, on a cold Saturday in mid-November, I drove back up to the cabin. I told nobody I was going. I parked at the turnoff. I walked in. The snow on the ground was about 4 inches deep, fresh from the night before, and there were no tracks on the path except mine. Nobody had been up there since the search team left. I went into the cabin. I started looking through things I hadn't looked through the first time. His desk drawers, his bookshelf, the boxes under his bed. I was looking for the audio recordings. He'd written that he'd made copies. He'd mailed one to his sister, but kept 2 for himself. I wanted to hear what he had heard. I found one of the recordings in a tin can on top of his bookshelf. A small can a man uses to hold spare buttons or fishing flies. It was a micro SD card. I drove home with it. I put it in an adapter. I copied the files onto my laptop. I sat in my kitchen with my headphones on at 1 in the morning, my wife asleep upstairs, and I listened. For 63 minutes, I listened to a man snoring in a loft above his living room, and to a clock ticking somewhere in the same room, and to the small sounds a wooden cabin makes settling in cold air. At 63 minutes and 17 seconds, the breathing started. He had described it well. It was slow. It was steady. The interval between inhale and exhale was about 11 seconds. The volume was even, which meant the source was stationary. It came from outside the cabin, but it was clear enough through whatever wall the recorder was nearest to that I could make out details. The breath was deep. Whatever was breathing had a chest, and the chest was large. I could hear, when I turned the volume up, what sounded like the faint movement of air through a long nasal passage. I could hear a faint wet click at the back of the throat at the start of each inhale. 19 minutes of that. Then it stopped. There was no sound of footsteps. There was no sound of departure. It just ended. But there was something else. Something Saul had not mentioned in the journal. At 17 minutes into the breathing, just before it ended, the recorder picked up another sound. A new sound, faint but clear. It came from the same direction. It was speech. I want to be careful how I describe this because I am about to make a claim that I know sounds outrageous. But I have listened to this recording maybe 300 times in the years since. I have played it for one person, an old friend from the Army who works as a linguistic analyst for a federal agency I'm not going to name. He listened to it 3 times in a row without speaking. Then he asked me where I'd gotten it, and I told him it had been recorded by a person who was now dead. And he handed me back the headphones, and he told me, "Wade, that is somebody trying to speak a human language with the wrong kind of mouth." He told me the phonemes were close, but not quite right. The consonants especially were being formed with what he described as inadequate articulators. The vowels were better, but the consonants were the work of a creature that had observed human speech and was attempting to reproduce it without the right anatomy. He said it was the linguistic equivalent of a person trying to whistle through chapped lips. Recognizable, but constrained. He also told me something I have not been able to forget. The cadence of the speech, he explained, was wrong in a way that suggested mimicry of a sample. As if the speaker had heard a small number of recordings of one specific voice and was attempting to reproduce that voice's rhythm. It was the way an actor learns a part by listening to tape. The vowels were stretched a little too long. The consonants landed a little too soft. He told me very quietly, "Wade, whoever this is, they were copying somebody specific. They had a model." I asked him whose voice it sounded like. He could not tell. It was somebody who had spent time in the Pacific Northwest, based on the residual vowel shapes, and somebody who had spoken with a clipped formal style that was not common in conversation. Like a surveyor reading off measurements, he told me, or maybe a soldier giving a report. Saul Mertens had been both. I asked him if he could make out any words. He said 2. Just 2. Repeated several times in the recording. The words were Saul and come. I want to take a moment here and tell you what it felt like to sit at my kitchen table at 1:30 in the morning and hear, on a recording made by a man who had subsequently disappeared, a non-human voice calling that man's name and asking him to come. It felt like being told that the world I'd lived in my whole life was a piece of paper and somebody had just held a match to one corner of it. I drove back up to the cabin the next weekend. I went farther this time. I followed the trail behind the cabin into the meadow where Saul had said he was going to sit. The snow was deeper now. Almost a foot. I followed it through the meadow and up into the timber on the far side. I walked for about an hour. The forest got thicker. The light got dimmer. The trees got bigger and older. I came to a place where the trees were leaning. Every trunk I could see in a wide arc was leaning in the same direction, leaning south, away from something to the north. The lean was slight but unmistakable. The branches were heavier on the south side. The crowns of the trees angled away. It looked like a forest that had been growing for a long time, in a strong, constant wind. Except there was no wind. And the prevailing wind in this country comes from the southwest, not the north. I stopped. I stood there. I listened. There was no sound, none, no birds, no movement of any animal, no water, no wind, just the sound of my own breath and my own heart and the faint creak of my boot on the snow when I shifted my weight. I'd been a hunter most of my life. I had spent thousands of hours in the woods. I had never heard silence like that. It was the silence of a place where the small life has decided to be somewhere else, where the chickadees and the squirrels and the deer and the porcupines and the field mice have all collectively voted with their feet, and the vote is unanimous and the vote is don't. I turned around. I'm not too proud to tell you that. I turned around and I walked back to the meadow, and then back to the cabin, and then back to my cruiser, and I drove home and I poured myself a triple. My hands were shaking the way Saul's handwriting had been shaking by the end of his journal, not from cold, not from exertion, from the same thing that had made him write the same sentence 2,000 times. The watchers never went home. I want to talk about what happened next, but first I want to talk about the missing persons. Because once I started looking, I found a pattern, and the pattern is the reason I cannot tell this story without telling all of it. Clearwater County and the adjacent counties in north central Idaho have a higher rate of missing persons cases than the population would suggest. We always knew this informally. We chalked it up to the terrain. The forest is huge and unforgiving, and people do go missing in it. They get lost, they fall, they die of exposure, they get attacked by bears occasionally, although that is rarer than people think. The rate is high, but the explanations have always been mundane. After I read Saul's journal, I started pulling files, not officially, just as a personal project. Late at night, when the office was empty, I'd go through the cold case archive and pull out missing persons files from the last 40 years. I made notes on a yellow legal pad I kept in my truck. I was looking for patterns, location, season, demographics, anything. What I found was this. Of the missing persons cases in our county since 1975, roughly 30% of them shared a cluster of features. The missing person was solitary or rural. They had no signs of forced struggle at their last known location. They had not taken supplies sufficient for the trip they appeared to have started. And in a surprising number of these cases, somebody connected to the person, often after the disappearance, reported having seen what they described as a large dog or large wolf or large bear in the area in the weeks leading up. Always a single sighting, always at distance, always described as having something off about it that the witness couldn't quite name. And in 7 of the cases, going back to 1983, the missing person had been keeping some kind of written record in the weeks before they disappeared, and that record had been found, and the record contained references to nighttime sounds, watching presences, or visual sightings of something in the woods that the writer felt was unusual. 7 out of approximately 280 missing persons cases in our county over 40 years. That is a small number. It is not zero. The oldest of the 7 was a man named Howard Tippett. He disappeared in October of 1983 when I was 9 years old. He had lived alone in a trapper's cabin on Lake Creek, about 20 miles north of where Saul's place would later be built. He was 62 when he vanished. The case file was thin, maybe 12 pages. He'd been a quiet man who came into Pierce twice a year for supplies and was otherwise unseen. When his sister, who lived in Lewiston, finally drove out to check on him in the March of '84, she found the cabin empty, the door standing open, snow drifted 3 feet into the front room. His traps were still set on the creek. His dog was dead in the yard, frozen, no marks on it. She had brought a notebook with her when she came to the sheriff's office to file the missing persons report. The notebook had been on his kitchen table, she told the deputy who took the report. It was tagged as evidence and never returned to her. The notebook was still in the cold case archive 33 years later, in a plastic sleeve, the pages brittle. I read it on a Wednesday night when I was alone in the office. Howard Tippett had been writing in that notebook about a knocking sound at his cabin door. 3 knocks, always the same pattern, starting in August of '83. He had written about smelling something in the woods he could not place. He'd noted his dog refusing to go out at night. In the last entry before he disappeared, he wrote that he had decided to walk up Lake Creek to where the old growth stand was, because something up there had been calling his name in a voice that was almost his own brother's voice, but not quite. And he wanted to know what it was. His brother had been dead for 9 years. He never came back. The file noted that the dog's body, when it was examined, had been frozen for some time, but that the eyes had been closed by a hand after death. The hand, the medical examiner had written, in a notation that nobody had thought to question at the time, must have been very large. I sat with that file for a long time. I read it twice, then a third time, then I put it back in the box and I walked out of the office and I drove home with the heater on full because I could not get warm. The pattern was the same, 83 years apart in the dates of disappearance, but the structure of it was identical. The knocking, the smell, the dog, the voice using the name of somebody dead, the walk into the timber to find out, the not coming back. 280 cases, 7 of them like this, spread across 40 years, roughly 1 every 6 years, as if whatever it was had a schedule, or a need, or a count that had to be kept. I started keeping the files on my own time. I made a map. I marked the last known locations. I marked the places where signs had been found, when signs had been found. I started looking for clusters. There was a cluster. There were two clusters, actually. One was a roughly oval-shaped region about 12 miles north of Saul's cabin, up the Skull Creek drainage into the high country. The other was much farther north, up near the Loxa River, in a region of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness that nobody ever goes to because the trails ran out in the 1960s and the new growth has reclaimed everything. I went to the Skull Creek cluster on a Saturday in late spring. I told my wife I was going hunting. I took my rifle and I took the journal in a sealed plastic bag inside my pack. I do not know why I took the journal. I think I wanted it with me. I drove up Skull Creek Road past Saul's turnoff. I drove for another 7 miles to where the road ended at an old log landing. I parked. I hiked north along a creek I knew the name of, but I am not going to say it because I do not want anybody trying to find this place. I walked for about 3 hours. I came to the trees again, the leaning trees, the silent ones. This time, I went into them. I do not have a clear memory of all of what happened that afternoon. I have written it down a few times, trying to reconstruct it, and the writing comes out different every time. The parts I am sure of are these. I walked into the leaning forest. The silence was the same. The light came through the canopy in long, horizontal beams, because the trees were spaced more widely here, like an old growth stand, and the trunks were enormous. I'm talking about cedars 5 and 6 feet across at the base, trees that had been alive when Lewis and Clark passed through and were already old then. I walked for maybe 20 minutes. The ground rose gradually. The air grew warmer. I have no rational explanation for why the air grew warmer. I was gaining elevation. The air should have grown colder, but the temperature went up. By the time I'd walked another 10 minutes, I'd unzipped my jacket. By the time I'd walked another 10 minutes after that, I'd taken it off entirely. I came to a place where the trees opened up into a clearing. The clearing was perfectly round. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. The clearing was a circle, approximately 200 yards in diameter, and the perimeter of the circle was marked by the largest cedar trees I have ever seen, growing at almost exactly even intervals, forming a ring. I counted them. There were 12. 12 trees in a ring, and inside the ring, no trees, grass and moss, and small flowering plants I didn't recognize. The grass was green, spring green, in a part of the forest where the rest of the ground was still brown and waiting. In the center of the clearing was a low rise, a mound of earth maybe 4 feet high and 30 feet across. The mound was covered in the same green grass. Around the base of the mound, partially buried in the dirt, were stones, worked stones, squared off, not natural. I have spent a lot of time since trying to find historical references to this place. Forest Service records, old maps, Nez Perce oral histories. I have found nothing. The clearing does not appear on any map I have access to. The Forest Service has no record of any structure or significant landform in that area. The Nez Perce historian I eventually consulted very carefully, without giving her exact coordinates, told me that yes, there are places in the high country that her grandfathers had told her never to visit. She would not tell me which places. She told me the words for them in Nez Perce, but she would not write them down. She said they were places that belonged to the ones before, and that the ones before were not gone. She used the phrase "the ones before." I asked her what that meant. The ones before, she explained, meant the inhabitants who were here when her people arrived, the ones whose territory they had agreed to respect, the ones who had agreed in turn to leave her people alone, mostly. This was understood. There had been an arrangement. The arrangement had held for a long time, she told me. It was the white settlers who broke it first, by going where they should not have gone. There had been consequences her people had known about, but the white people had to learn. I asked her if she believed in these creatures. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she told me, "Deputy, I am 81 years old, and I am not in the habit of pretending to believe things to make white men comfortable, and I am also not in the habit of pretending not to believe things to make white men comfortable. I believe what I have been told, and I believe what I have seen, and I have seen one of them at distance once when I was a child, with my grandfather, and he told me to look at the ground and not look up. And I looked up anyway because I was a child. And what I saw I will not describe to you, but I will tell you that my grandfather was right, and I should not have looked up." She would not tell me anything else. I came back to the clearing several times over the next 2 years. Sometimes I sat on a log at the edge of the trees and just watched. Sometimes I walked the perimeter. I never went up onto the mound. I never even crossed the line of the 12 trees. I felt very strongly that to cross that line was to enter someplace I did not belong, and I felt also, just as strongly, that to enter that place would have consequences I could not predict. I went there once in deep winter, in February. The snow was 2 feet deep everywhere, except inside the ring of 12 trees, where the grass on the mound was still green and the ground was bare for about 10 feet out from the trunks. I stood at the edge of the snow line and looked at the boundary, that perfect circular edge where winter stopped existing, and I had the very clear thought that I was looking at the seam between two different versions of the world. I sat on a log and stayed for about an hour. I did not speak. I did not move. I tried to make my presence small. I tried to think respectful thoughts, although I am not sure what good that does, or whether they can read thoughts or whether thinking is even a category they have. I do not know what they are. Around the time I would have started to feel cold, I felt warmer instead. The wind, which had been moving the upper branches of the cedars, dropped. I could see my breath, and then I could not. The air around me had grown still and warmer in a small zone, just where I was sitting. I held my hands out and felt the difference between the air at my elbows and the air a foot away from me. It lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then it ended, and the cold came back, and I understood I had been thanked. I walked back to the truck. I drove home. I did not tell my wife, although she noticed that night that I sat at the kitchen table for a long time and would not eat dinner. She asked me what was wrong. I told her I had a headache. I went to bed. I have thought about that warmth a lot. The clearing was always the same, always silent, always warmer than it should have been. The grass on the mound was always green, even when the rest of the country was buried in snow. I do not know how that is possible. I am not a botanist. I have my theories. None of them are satisfying. I never saw one of them at the clearing. I want to say that clearly. In the dozen or so times I sat at the edge of the trees and watched, I never saw movement, never heard a sound I could attribute to one of them, never had a sighting. The clearing was empty, but I felt them. This is going to sound like the worst kind of subjective garbage, and I know that, and I'm telling you anyway because it's what was true. There was an awareness at the clearing, a quality of being observed, the way you can sit in a room with another person who isn't looking at you and still know they're aware of you. The clearing had that quality. The clearing was paying attention. The clearing knew I was there. And on one of my visits in the autumn of 2017, almost exactly a year after Saul Mertens disappeared, I found something at the base of one of the 12 trees. It was a small pile of objects. The pile was about the size of a softball. It was made of things that had been deliberately placed. 3 pine cones, a small piece of quartz, a bird's feather, dark, possibly raven, a scrap of what I think was bone, polished smooth, and at the top of the pile, a strip of fabric. I picked up the fabric. It was a piece of blue plaid flannel. I recognized the pattern. Saul had been wearing the same shirt the last time I'd given him a ride. He'd been wearing that pattern in the photograph his sister had given me when we filed the missing persons report. The shirt that had been in his closet was not the one in the photograph. I'd noted it, but not made anything of it. He'd been wearing the plaid shirt when he disappeared. A scrap of it was at the base of one of the 12 trees. I want to tell you that I screamed or ran or did something dramatic. I did not. I knelt there with the fabric in my fingers for a long time. The wind moved through the canopy and made a soft sound. The mound in the center of the clearing held its silence and its green grass. The light shifted as the sun moved across the sky. I understood, sitting there, that the fabric had been put there for me to find. They were communicating. I had been coming there for months. I had been respectful. I had not crossed the line. I had watched, and they had watched me watching. And now they had left me something to find. A confirmation, a small grace, a way of saying, we know what you were doing, and we know what you were looking for. And the man you were looking for went where he chose to go. I put the fabric in my pocket. I sat there until the sun started to drop. Then I stood up and I walked back the way I had come. I drove home. I did not tell my wife. I did not tell anyone. I kept going up there, less frequently, once or twice a year, always alone, always respectful. I never found another sign. But I started to notice things at my own home, small things at first. Sounds outside the windows at night that did not match any animal I knew. The dogs in the neighborhood became reluctant to be outside after dark. My wife mentioned that she had been hearing footsteps on the back porch at night and had assumed it was a stray cat, but the footsteps were heavier than a cat would be. I told her I'd look into it. I sat up that night with my rifle. I heard nothing. I started to feel watched. It is hard to explain what that feeling is to somebody who has never had it. It is not paranoia. Paranoia is the feeling of imagined attention. This was different. This was the certain quiet awareness that something existed in proximity to my life, that was aware of my life, that had taken an interest, that was not necessarily hostile, but that was there. The same quality I had felt at the clearing, but here, in town, in my house, on my street. I started looking out my back window at night. The yard behind my house backed up to a stand of pine trees, and then a vacant lot, and then more trees, and eventually the foothills. I would stand at the back window with the lights off and look out, and I would sometimes see nothing, and I would sometimes see something. A shape at the edge of the trees, a vertical shape that did not match the trees, standing still, not advancing, just standing. In 2020, I put in my retirement paperwork. I had hit 11 years, which was enough to leave with partial benefits. I had been planning to do 25 and retire properly. I cut it short by 14 years. I told my wife it was burnout. That was partially true. The full truth I was not prepared to tell her then. And I am still not prepared to tell her now, although she has, I think, figured most of it out. She has not asked me to confirm it. I think she does not want to confirm it. I think she wants to live in a version of the world where her husband retired early because the job was hard, and not in a version of the world where her husband retired early because something in the forest had begun to notice him. We moved to Pendleton, Oregon. We are not in the woods here. We are in a town with sidewalks and a Walmart and a community college, and the country around us is mostly wheat and rolling brown hills. No deep timber, no mountains, not the way Idaho has mountains. I can sleep through the night here, mostly. I do not see the shape at the edge of the trees anymore. I do not feel watched, but I dream about the clearing sometimes. I dream about walking into it. I dream about crossing the line of the 12 cedars and walking up onto the mound and lying down in the green grass and feeling. Whatever is below the mound become aware of me, and then turn its attention on me, the full weight of its attention, the way a star turns toward a moon, and I dream about that attention pinning me to the grass, and I dream about understanding, for the duration of the dream, what I am and what they are, and the distance between us, and the arrangement. I wake up from those dreams crying. I do not tell my wife. I want to come back to the Book of Enoch for a minute, because I have spent 6 years thinking about this, and I want to lay out what I think is true. Enoch describes the Watchers as a class of angels who came down to Mount Hermon and took human wives and produced offspring. 200 of them, the text says. They taught humans things. Metallurgy, cosmetics, the cutting of stones, the casting of charms, the reading of stars. The text presents this as a transgression. The angels were not supposed to mix with humans. The mixing produced abominations. The abominations were the Nephilim, the giants, and they walked the earth, and they consumed everything, and they spread suffering, and eventually God flooded the world to wash them away. But Enoch is careful about what happened next. The text says the Nephilim died in the flood, but it also says their spirits remained. The unclean spirits that walk the earth, the demons in the later Jewish and Christian tradition, those are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, and they cause harm because they were born of forbidden union, and they have no proper place to go. That is the canonical reading. There is a less canonical reading, an older reading, that some scholars believe is preserved in fragmentary form in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in certain rabbinical commentaries. That reading is that not all the Nephilim were killed in the flood. Some were hidden. The verse from Enoch chapter 10 that Saul underlined says the Lord commanded that the children of the Watchers be bound in the valleys of the earth until the day of judgment. Bound, not killed. Bound, hidden. If you take that reading seriously, then somewhere in the world there are still Nephilim. Or something descended from them, hybrid beings. The angels that came down were not the same kind of being as the angels who stayed up. The Watchers were a class that had its own physical form. The text describes them as having faces and bodies, not as pure spirit. When they mixed with humans, the offspring would have inherited both lineages. Tall, strong, long-lived, not entirely human, not entirely whatever the Watchers were. The descriptions in the Apocrypha and the related Mesopotamian traditions are remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with one another. The Nephilim are tall, they have unusual facial features that variously include elongated heads, animal-like features, and eyes described as not matching their faces. They are intelligent, they speak, they are old, they live in remote places, in valleys and high places and forests. In the Pacific Northwest oral traditions, the same description appears under different names. The Stick Indians of the Salish, the Ta-Ta-Klea of the Yakama, the Tsiatko of the southern Salish. Various names across various tribes, but the consistent description is of tall beings, human-shaped but not human, that inhabit remote forested areas, that are intelligent, that have territories, that communicate in voices, and that should not be disturbed. And then there is the dogman. The modern American cryptid tradition of the dogman, going back at least to the 1880s, describes a bipedal creature, 7 feet tall, with a canine head and a man-shaped body, that inhabits remote forests in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Idaho, Montana, the Pacific Northwest. Encounters are reported by hunters, hikers, rural residents. The reports are consistent in their physical description and in the effective quality of the encounter. Witnesses report feeling intensely observed. Witnesses report that the creature does not behave like a predator. Witnesses report intelligence in its movements and apparent decision-making. The Book of Enoch describes hybrid forest beings. The dogman tradition describes hybrid forest beings. They are not the same tradition. They emerged in completely different cultural contexts, thousands of years apart. They describe the same thing. I am not telling you what to think, I am telling you what I have come to think. I think the Watchers had children. I think the children of the Watchers were not all destroyed. I think some of them survived in the high places and the deep forests of the earth and have been there ever since. I think over time their numbers have decreased and their territory has shrunk and they have learned to be cautious. I think they are still here. I think they walk the Clearwater Forest and the Selway Bitterroot and probably 100 other places that fit the profile. I think they have arrangements with certain human populations who learned a long time ago to recognize their territories and stay out. I think when those arrangements are broken, things happen. I think Saul Mertens broke the arrangement by getting curious. And I think they did not kill him. I think they let him come up to the meadow. I think they let him sit with them and learn something. I think he came back and tried to write what he had learned and discovered he could not write it, because human language is not built for what he had been shown, and the only thing his hand would write was the one sentence that contained the truest part of what he understood. The Watchers never went home. They are still here. They are still here. They are still here. I think eventually he went back to them and stayed. I think they did not take him. I think he chose. And I think they let me see the clearing. They let me come. Because I came respectfully, because I left when I should have left, because I never crossed the line. They let me find the scrap of his shirt because I needed to know. They watched me when I started to ask questions in town, and when I stopped asking, they stopped watching. They are not malevolent. That is the part I want to be clear about. They are not the demons of Christian tradition. They are not the malicious, unclean spirits of the post-flood narrative. They are something else. They are tired, and they are old, and they are guarding something, or being guarded by something, and they want very much to be left alone. When you leave them alone, they leave you alone. When you do not, they have ways of communicating that are sometimes patient and sometimes not. I have been retired for 6 years. I have not been back to Idaho in 2. I do not think I will go back. My wife and I have talked about traveling, and we have talked about Idaho, and I have made excuses each time, and she has, I think, understood without my having to say it. But I want to say one more thing. 2 weeks ago, I went out to get the mail. It was Tuesday morning. The mail was the usual stuff. Bills, a flyer for a chiropractor, and then at the bottom of the pile, there was a small package. Plain brown paper. No return address. My name and address written in pencil in a hand I had never seen before, but that I recognized somehow at a level below thought. I took it inside. I sat at the kitchen table. My wife was at her book club. I opened it. Inside was a single object. A small bundle of pine boughs tied together with what looked like sinew. Inside the bundle, a single tooth, long, curved, about 3.5 inches. I sat there for a long time. There was no note. There did not need to be. The message was the same message Saul had received 9 years ago in the deep woods of Idaho. We see you, we have not forgotten. The arrangement holds. I keep the bundle in a wooden box on a shelf in my closet. I do not look at it often. I do not show it to anybody. What I take from it is that, whatever they are not bound by distance the way we are. The valleys of the earth, the text says. Maybe the valleys are everywhere. Maybe the territory is bigger than I understood. Maybe they were never just in Idaho. Maybe what Saul thought of as a single population walking the high country was just the one he could see, and the rest of them are everywhere, in every old forest and every empty stretch of country, in numbers I do not want to think about. I do not know what they want me to do with this knowledge. I have wondered. I have thought maybe they want me to talk, to tell the story, to put it out into the world the way Saul tried to put it out and could not, because his hand could only write that one sentence at the end. So, I am telling it. I want to add one more piece before I'm done, because it is the part I have thought about most, and it is the part that, if you are still listening, I would ask you to think about with me, because I cannot make sense of it on my own. In the months after I retired, before we moved to Pendleton, I went back to the Lewiston Library. I wanted to look at the books Saul had looked at. I sat in the same room he had sat in. The librarian was a woman named Constance Marek, who had been there for 30 years and remembered him. He had come in for 3 days in the middle of August, she told me. She had helped him find some of the books. She remembered specifically because so few people came in asking for the Apocrypha, and she had been surprised that an older man who looked like he'd been logging his whole life was sitting at the table working through the Book of Jubilees with a yellow legal pad. There was something else, though. Another man had come in 2 weeks after Saul left, asking about the same books. He had told her he was a friend of Saul's and was trying to understand what Saul had been researching. She had been suspicious and not told him much. He had looked through the books anyway, then left. I asked her what the man had looked like. She thought about it for a long moment. He had been very tall, she told me. His clothes had not fit him quite right, like he wasn't used to wearing them. His face had been odd in a way she could not specify. His hands had been long, his eyes had been dark, he had been polite. He had thanked her for her time. He had spoken with a faint accent she had not been able to place. She had assumed he was Eastern European, and had not thought about it again until I came in and asked. I asked her what day he had come in. She checked her records. She had logged him in on the sign-in sheet because he had asked for the restricted section. The date was September 30th, 2016, 2 days after Saul Mertens walked out to the meadow behind his cabin to sit with them. He had only stayed for a few hours, she told me. He had photographed certain pages with his phone. He had returned the books to her and left. She had asked his name for the sign-in sheet. He had written it in a hand that looked careful, the way a child writes when practicing penmanship. The name on the sign-in sheet was Saul Mertens. I do not have an explanation for that. I have thought about it for years. I have considered several possibilities and none of them sit easy. The simplest possibility is that the man was lying, that he gave a false name, that he was someone else entirely. That is the answer I would have given as a deputy. The other possibility I do not want to put words to, and I am not going to, but you can think about it if you want. I have thought about it enough for both of us. What I will say is that the last entry in Saul's journal, before the 40 pages, said he was going to go to them. And the verse from Enoch he had underlined said the children of the watchers were bound in the valleys of the earth until the day of judgment. Bound, not destroyed. And the dogman tradition, the consistent global tradition of upright wolf things in the deep forest, suggests that whatever those bound creatures were doing in the valleys, they had not forgotten how to move among us when they needed to. The Stick Indians, the Ta-Ta-Klea, the Watchers of Enoch, they all had one thing in common in the oral traditions. They could move in human shape when they chose to. They could come down out of the high country wearing the form of a person, and they could walk in the towns, and they could ask their questions, and they could leave again. I am not telling you Saul Mertens came back. I do not have proof of that. What I am telling you is that 2 days after he went to them, someone walked into the Lewiston Library who matched a description that does not match any human I have ever met. And that person used his name, and that person looked at the same books he had looked at, and that person photographed pages and left. And I am telling you that the eyes were dark, and the hands were long, and the clothes did not fit. The Watchers never went home. Some of them are still here. They are old, and they are tired, and they would prefer to be left alone. And when they cannot be left alone, they have ways of asking. They have asked Saul, and he answered. They have asked me, and I have not yet answered. I do not know when they will ask again, or what shape the asking will take. If you live near the deep forests of the inland Pacific Northwest, and you start hearing things at night that you cannot explain, and you start finding marks at 7 feet up on the trees behind your house, and you find your porch chair turned to face the door, you should consider very carefully whether to investigate. And if you decide to investigate, you should consider very carefully how much you want to know. There are things in the high country older than the country itself, and they have been there a long time, and they will be there long after we are gone. If they leave you something on your porch, do not open it. Do not throw it away. Set it on a shelf. Leave it alone, and do not say their names, even if you think you know them. They remember names. They have always remembered names. That is what they do. That is what they have always done. That is what the Watchers are for. I am going to set this aside now. I have said what I came to say. If you are out there in those woods tonight, listening, I hope you hear it. I hope you understand I was respectful. I hope the arrangement holds. I left a bundle on my back porch last night. Pine boughs, sinew, a single tooth I picked up in a parking lot in Pendleton 6 months ago. A coyote tooth, nothing special. I left it as an offering. I do not know if offerings work. I do not know if they will recognize it as one. But I felt I needed to give something back, after what Saul gave, after what was given to me at the base of that tree. This morning, the bundle was gone. There were no tracks in the dust on my porch. There was no sign anything had been there, but it was gone. So maybe they accepted it. Maybe they didn't. Maybe a raccoon took it. I'm telling myself it was a raccoon. I'm telling myself I'm an old man living in a town with sidewalks and a Walmart, and that there is nothing in the wheat fields outside this town that knows my name. But I am going to go to bed tonight, and I am going to look out my back window before I close the blinds, the way I always do now. And I'm going to scan the line of cottonwoods at the edge of my yard, and I am going to look for the vertical shape that does not match the trees. And if I see it, I am not going to be surprised. I am going to nod to it because it is owed that. And I am going to close the blinds. And I am going to sleep, or try to. The watchers never went home. That is all I have. That is everything. If you find this someday, in a box in an attic or a folder on a hard drive, and you read it through to the end, I hope you take from it what I would want you to take. There is more in the world than what we were taught. There are arrangements older than the country. There are old things still walking in the deep places of the earth. They will let you alone if you let them alone. They will speak to you in their broken voices if you make them. They will come to you in town if you find what you should not have found. Be careful in the high country. Be careful in the old forests. Be careful what you write in your journals. And if you ever read the same sentence 40 pages in a row in a dead man's notebook, do not assume he was crazy. Assume he was trying to tell you something the language could not hold. Assume he was right.